There was a time in history when the sound of church bells did not call people to prayer. It warned them. Not of storms, not of disease, but of men. Along the coasts of Europe, villagers learned to look at the sea differently. Not as a source of life, but as a doorway to death. Because the sea did not always bring fish. Sometimes it brought something far worse. A name was whispered, often not spoken at all. Vikings. No declaration of war, no warning banners, just silence. And somehow, the fear arrived before the blood ever did. Before the Vikings became a nightmare, Europe was a world built on routine. Coastal villages lived predictable lives. Morning work, midday trade, evenings filled with prayer. Most people never traveled far from where they were born. The sea was a companion, not a threat. Monasteries stood without walls. Churches were built on faith, not defense. Because danger, they believed, always came from land. No one expected an enemy to rise from the horizon without warning, without reason they could understand. This was not a weak world. It was a trusting one. And trust, in history, is often the first thing that breaks. At first, they saw sails. Dark shapes cutting through the mist. Slow. Quiet. Some thought they were merchants. Others barely noticed. But something felt wrong. The ships moved without sound. No flags, no signals of peace. As they drew closer, details emerged. Long hulls, carved dragon heads, men standing still, watching. There was no time to prepare, no time to flee. Within moments, the world they knew collapsed. And from those ashes, a legend was born. The stories of the Vikings were not written by those who defeated them. They were written by those who survived. And fear has a way of reshaping memory. Weapons became unstoppable. Courage became inhuman. Faces turned monstrous. Details blurred, and blurred details grew larger with every retelling. The Vikings stopped being men. They became symbols. A force that could not be reasoned with, a violence that could not be contained. But legends rarely tell the full story. Behind the terror, the Vikings were not a single people. They were not one nation, not one kingdom. They were farmers, fishermen, traders, communities from the north living on harsh land that offered little forgiveness. When the soil failed them, they did what humans have always done. They moved. Not driven by savagery, but by survival. But survival, when carried by armed men, is always mistaken for cruelty. What history rarely admits is this: the Vikings did not fear death. That part is true, but they feared something else. They feared terrain they could not read, cultures they could not predict, enemies who did not fight by familiar rules. When strength no longer guaranteed victory, fear found its way in. And history, especially victorious history, does not like recording fear. So the real question is not, how brutal were the Vikings? It is, how incomplete is the story we were told? Because behind their reputation lies a far more complex truth about humanity, environment, and fear itself. To understand the Vikings, we must stop seeing them as legends and start seeing them as people. And that is where the real story begins. When we say the word Vikings, we imagine a single people, one culture, one identity, one unstoppable force sweeping across Europe. But that image is wrong. The Vikings were never one nation. They were never united. They never even called themselves Vikings. That word came later, given to them by others, often by those who feared them. To understand the Vikings, we must first dismantle the idea that they were a single civilization, because the truth is far more fragmented and far more human. The Viking world was shaped by geography. Scandinavia was not a unified land, it was a broken one. Mountains cut communities apart, forests isolated valleys. Long winters turned short distances into impossible journeys. A village on one fjord might as well have lived in another world from a village just a few miles away. There were no highways, no centralized power, no shared capital. What existed instead were local identities. People belonged to their family, their settlement, their land, not to a nation. And this isolation shaped everything, from how they lived to how they fought. What we call Vikings were actually many groups. The Danes, who looked south and west. The Norwegians, who followed the Atlantic to the British Isles, Iceland, and beyond. The Swedes, who traveled east into rivers, trade routes, and foreign empires. They spoke similar languages. They shared gods and myths. But they did not share loyalty. A Dane did not fight for a Norwegian king. A Swede did not answer to a Danish warlord. Alliances were temporary. Power shifted constantly. Today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. This was not chaos. It was how survival worked in a fractured world. Here is something rarely explained. Viking was not an ethnicity. It was an activity. To go Viking meant to leave home to raid, trade, or explore. A man could be a farmer most of his life and a Viking for only one season. Many never went at all. This matters because it changes how we see them. The Vikings were not a society built entirely on violence. They were a society where violence was one option among many. Trade, migration, settlement. Raiding was simply the most visible and the most terrifying to those on the receiving end. There was no Viking empire, no emperor, no standing army. Power belonged to local chieftains, men who ruled through reputation, wealth, and personal loyalty. If a leader failed, people left. If he grew weak, another replaced him. Authority was fragile. And this fragility created a dangerous dynamic. To maintain power, a leader had to provide rewards: land, silver, prestige. Raids were not just violence, they were politics. Success brought loyalty. Failure brought collapse. Every expedition carried risk, not just of death, but of irrelevance. When we see the Vikings as one people, we miss the point. They were not united by ambition. They were united by circumstance. Harsh land, limited resources, endless competition. Their world rewarded those who adapted quickly and punished those who stood still. This fragmentation explains everything that follows: their sudden appearances, their unpredictability, their ability to vanish as quickly as they arrived. And it also explains something else: why they retreated sometimes, why they avoided certain lands, why fear, not just fury, shaped their decisions. Because a divided people must always calculate risk more carefully. And that calculation will shape everything that comes next.
Fear was not a side effect of Viking warfare. It was the strategy. Long before the first sword was drawn, long before shields collided, the Vikings understood something fundamental about human nature. People break before they fight. And so, the real battlefield was never just land or sea. It was the mind. When a Viking ship appeared on the horizon, it was already too late. Not because the ships were fast, but because they were unexpected. The Vikings did not announce their arrival. They did not challenge their enemies openly. They did not follow the rules of formal war. They arrived at dawn, or in fog, or when guards were tired and defenses were thin. Surprise was their first weapon. Fear was the second. To the people of medieval Europe, war had a structure. Armies gathered, banners were raised, warnings were sent. There was time to prepare. The Vikings shattered that expectation. They came without warning, from a direction no one considered dangerous. The sea, once trusted, became a threat. And once fear enters daily life, it changes everything. Farmers stop working the fields. Fishermen stop going to sea. Communities begin to weaken themselves long before any battle begins. The Vikings understood visibility. Their ships were designed to be seen. Long, narrow hulls, high prows carved into the shapes of beasts, dragons, serpents. These were not decorations, they were messages. From a distance, the ships looked unnatural, almost alive. To people who believed deeply in omens and signs, this mattered. The Vikings did not just arrive, they appeared, and appearance alone could collapse resistance. Then there was reputation. By the time many villages encountered Vikings directly, they had already heard the stories. Stories of monasteries burned, of priests killed at the altar, of entire communities erased. Whether these stories were exaggerated did not matter. Fear does not require accuracy. It only requires belief. And belief traveled faster than ships ever could. In many cases, the Vikings did not need to fight. Communities fled, defenses were abandoned, tribute was offered freely. Terror achieved what armies could not. The Vikings also understood cruelty as communication. Violence was not random, it was deliberate, public, visible. Executions were meant to be seen, punishments were meant to be remembered, not because the Vikings were uniquely brutal, but because they knew memory was power. One village destroyed could silence 10 others. Fear, once established, became self-sustaining. But this strategy came with risks. Fear works best when it is unpredictable. If terror becomes routine, people adapt. And the Vikings learned this lesson quickly. As defenses improved, as coastal communities fortified themselves, fear alone became insufficient. This forced the Vikings to evolve. They adjusted tactics, they shifted targets, they disappeared when resistance hardened. Fear was a tool, not a guarantee. There's a common misconception that Viking raids were large-scale invasions. Many were not. Many involved fewer than 100 men, sometimes far fewer. Yet they were devastating. Because the goal was never total conquest, it was disruption, destabilization, breaking the rhythm of life. Once fear took hold, numbers mattered less. A small force could appear larger, stronger, unstoppable. Perception became reality. But fear cuts both ways. To rely on terror is to depend on the reactions of others, and when those reactions change, so must the strategy. The Vikings began to encounter communities that did not break, places that learned to watch the sea, to ring bells early, to organize resistance. Fear still existed, but it no longer paralyzed. And this created something new: uncertainty. Uncertainty is dangerous for those who rely on intimidation. When fear stops working, risk increases. Casualties rise, rewards shrink. For Viking leaders, this was a serious problem. They were not fighting for ideology, they were fighting for survival, status, and loyalty. If raids failed, their authority collapsed. Men left, alliances dissolved. Fear was their advantage, and losing it meant everything. So when we imagine the Vikings as fearless warriors, we misunderstand them. They were not reckless, they were precise. They knew exactly how much fear to apply and when to pull back.
And that ability to read the emotional landscape of their enemies was one of their greatest strengths. But it also revealed something deeper. Fear was not just something they inflicted, it was something they monitored, something they respected. Because fear, uncontrolled, can destroy both sides. In the next chapter of this story, we will see what happened when the Vikings encountered enemies who understood fear just as well as they did. Enemies that did not flee, did not panic, did not break. And when terror failed, the Vikings were forced to confront something far dangerous than resistance. They were forced to confront limitation. And that realization would change the course of their history.
The image most people have of the Vikings is simple. Men wearing horned helmets, wild hair, endless violence, no law, no culture. That image is powerful and almost entirely wrong. The horned helmet alone tells us everything we need to know. There is no archaeological evidence that Vikings wore horned helmets in battle, not a single reliable find. The image came centuries later, created by artists, playwrights, and costume designers. It looked dramatic, it looked savage, and it stuck. Because once a myth fits a fear, it becomes more convincing than truth. Medieval chroniclers played a role in this distortion. Most written accounts of the Vikings come from their victims, monks, clergy, court historians, people whose worlds were shattered by sudden violence. Their writings were not neutral records, they were emotional responses. To them, the Vikings were not neighbors or traitors, they were punishment, a sign of divine anger. And so the language reflected that belief. The Vikings were described as demons, as beasts, as agents of chaos sent by God, not as human beings. This framing mattered, because once the Vikings were dehumanized, everything about them became exaggerated. Their violence became limitless, their cruelty became ritualistic, their motives became unknowable. But history rarely works that way. Violence, no matter how extreme, is usually purposeful, and Viking violence was no exception. The myth of the Vikings as mindless barbarians also ignores something critical. They had laws, complex ones. Local assemblies called things, where disputes were settled, leaders were challenged, and laws were spoken aloud. These were not societies without structure. They were societies without centralized power, which is very different. Order existed, just not in a form outsiders recognized. Viking society also valued restraint. This may seem impossible to reconcile with their reputation, but uncontrolled violence was dangerous. A man who killed recklessly invited revenge. Feuds could last generations. Entire families could be wiped out. So, violence had rules. Even honor killings followed patterns, limits. Myth erased these details because nuance weakens terror. Another distortion lies in how Viking religion is portrayed. They are often depicted as death-obsessed warriors eager to die in battle, but their belief system was far more complex. Yes, Valhalla mattered, but survival mattered more. The gods did not demand suicide, they demanded courage, and courage included knowing when to retreat. This distinction is often lost because it contradicts the image of endless aggression. The myth also ignores Viking creativity. They were skilled shipbuilders, metalworkers, poets. They composed long-form oral poetry. They carved intricate designs into everyday objects. A culture obsessed only with destruction does not create beauty. Yet beauty does not fit the myth, so it is excluded. Why did these distortions persist? Because they served a purpose. For medieval Christians, the Vikings represented chaos from beyond the known world. For later European nations, they were a convenient symbol of primitive violence, a contrast to civilized identity. And in modern times, the myth became entertainment. Films, comics, video games. Each layer moved further from reality, but the core image remained: savage, fearsome, other.
This matters because myths shape interpretation. When we assume the Vikings were irrational, we stop asking why they acted as they did. When we assume they loved violence, we ignore economic pressure, political competition, and environmental hardship. The myth simplifies history, and simplification is always misleading. The Vikings were dangerous. There is no denying that. But danger does not require madness. Their actions followed logic. Harsh logic, but logic nonetheless. And once we strip away the myth, something unsettling appears. The Vikings were not monsters. They were people responding to a world that rewarded aggression and punished weakness. And that realization forces us to ask a harder question. If placed in the same conditions, would others have acted differently? In the next segment, we will confront a reality the myths try to hide. Moments when the Vikings failed, when their fear tactics collapsed, when they met resistance that did not bend. Because legends rarely talk about defeat, but history is shaped by it. And the Viking story is no exception.
The Viking story is usually told as a series of victories, raids that succeeded, kings that fell, cities that burned. But history is never built only on triumph. It is shaped just as much by moments of failure. And the Viking Age was no exception. There were places the Vikings attacked and could not take. There were campaigns that ended in retreat. There were lands they chose to avoid altogether. These moments rarely appear in legend because defeat does not inspire fear. But they reveal something far more important. They show the limits of Viking power. One of the earliest lessons came quickly. Surprise worked, but only once. After the first waves of raids, coastal communities adapted. Watchtowers appeared. Early warning systems were built. Church bells rang not for prayer, but for alarm. The sea was no longer ignored. And as awareness spread, the Vikings began to lose their greatest advantage. England provides a clear example. Early raids were devastating. Monasteries fell easily. Resistance was scattered. But over time, kingdoms responded. Fortifications increased. Standing forces were organized. Kings learned to coordinate defense. Alfred the Great did not defeat the Vikings by matching their ferocity. He defeated them by removing their unpredictability. When raids met prepared soldiers instead of panic, the cost of attack rose sharply. And rising cost changes behavior. The Vikings also struggled inland. Their ships gave them mobility. Rivers were highways. Coasts were gateways. But away from water, their strength weakened. Long supply lines, hostile terrain, local populations who knew the land better. Raids deep into unfamiliar territory became dangerous. In many cases, the Vikings withdrew not because they were beaten, but because the risk outweighed the reward. This was not cowardice, it was calculation. Ireland tells a similar story. The Vikings established strongholds, they founded towns, they controlled trade. But full domination never came easily. Local resistance was constant. Alliances shifted. Battles were costly and unresolved. The Vikings adapted, settling instead of conquering. When violence alone failed, they changed strategy. And that shift itself is a form of defeat rarely acknowledged. Then there were regions the Vikings avoided. Dense forests, mountainous interiors, territories where ambush was common and escape difficult. These lands offered little wealth and high risk. The Vikings were not interested in proving dominance. They were interested in surviving and returning home richer than before. If a place did not offer that possibility, it was ignored.
Legends call this restraint mysterious. In reality, it was practical. Even at sea, failure followed them. Storms destroyed fleets. Ships were lost before reaching land. Entire expeditions vanished without ever encountering an enemy. The ocean that empowered the Vikings also humbled them. Nature did not fear reputation, and it punished overconfidence. These failures mattered deeply to Viking leaders. Power depended on success. A chieftain who failed to deliver wealth lost followers. Men drifted away. Reputation collapsed. Leadership was fragile. And failure, even once, could end a career. This pressure made Viking decisions cautious, not reckless. Every raid was weighed, every target assessed. Because defeat did not just mean loss, it meant disappearance. This reality challenges the myth of endless Viking aggression. They did not attack everywhere. They did not fight every battle. They chose. And sometimes they chose to walk away. These moments do not make them weak. They make them human. Understanding Viking failure changes how we see their fear. They did not fear battle. They feared losing relevance. They feared becoming leaders no one followed. They feared a world where strength no longer worked. And that fear shaped their limits. In the next segment, we will explore a different kind of challenge. Not enemies with armies, but environments that could not be conquered. Landscapes that resisted control. Cultures that refused intimidation. Because sometimes the most powerful force opposing the Vikings was not another sword, but the world itself.
The Vikings are often remembered for the enemies they faced. Kings, armies, cities. But some of their greatest challenges were not human at all. They were environmental. And unlike armies, the environment could not be intimidated. The Viking world was built around water. Rivers were roads, seas were highways. Ships gave them reach, speed, and escape. But this dependence came with limits. When the water ended, so did much of their power. Dense forests were among their greatest obstacles. In thick woodland, ships were useless. Formations broke down. Visibility vanished. An enemy did not need numbers, only patience. Ambush replaced battle. Attrition replaced shock. In these environments, the Vikings lost their advantage. Strength meant little when you could not see where danger came from. Mountains presented a different problem. Narrow passes restricted movement. Weather changed without warning. Supply lines became fragile. A force that moved quickly on water moved slowly on stone. Here, retreat was not simple. Escape was uncertain. The Vikings understood this. They avoided regions where withdrawal was impossible, not because they feared death, but because survival required options. Then there were climates they could not control. Extreme cold they understood, they were born into it. But unfamiliar heat, humidity, and disease were another matter. In southern regions, illness killed silently. No honor, no glory. A warrior could survive battle and die weeks later from something unseen. These losses were unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Even familiar environments turned hostile. Storms destroyed fleets. Ice trapped ships. Winds scattered formations. The sea that carried the Vikings could also erase them. Entire expeditions vanished, not to enemies, but to nature. There were no songs written for these losses, no victories to remember, only absence.
The Vikings learned quickly that the world could not be conquered the way cities could. Land did not surrender. Weather did not negotiate. This forced restraint. Targets were chosen carefully. Seasons mattered. Timing became critical. Raids were planned around tides, winds, and daylight. Failure to respect the environment meant disaster. This awareness shaped Viking psychology. They did not see the world as something to dominate. They saw it as something to endure. Survival depended on reading signs, clouds, currents, terrain. A leader who ignored these signals did not remain a leader for long. Environmental limits also explain why Viking expansion had boundaries. They reached far, but not everywhere. Some lands resisted not through armies, but through isolation, others through exhaustion. The Vikings did not fail to conquer these places. They chose not to try, because some victories cost more than they offer. This understanding reframes Viking restraint. Avoidance was not weakness, it was intelligence. Knowing when not to fight was as important as knowing how, and this knowledge kept them alive. In the next segment, we will examine what happened when the Vikings encountered people who had learned the same lessons, communities that used terrain, weather, and patience as weapons. Peoples who used terrain, weather, and patience as weapons. When fear and environment worked together against them, and when the Vikings realized that some opponents could not be overwhelmed, only endured.
When the Vikings arrived, they did not enter empty lands. They entered worlds already shaped by fear, memory, and survival. And the people they encountered were not always passive victims. Some learned, some adapted, some waited. At first, many communities reacted with panic. They fled inland. They abandoned settlements. They surrendered wealth to avoid violence. Fear worked. But fear, repeated too often, loses its edge. Over time, people began to observe patterns. The Vikings came by sea. They favored certain seasons. They struck quickly and left just as fast. These patterns became opportunities. Coastal communities changed. Villages relocated. Monasteries fortified their walls. Watchposts appeared along cliffs and rivers. Bells rang earlier. Warnings traveled faster. The element of surprise weakened, and with it, the psychological dominance the Vikings relied on. Some communities went further. They stopped fleeing. They gathered. They organized. They learned to fight back. Not by chasing Viking ships, but by denying easy targets. Food was removed, supplies hidden, harbors blocked. If the Vikings could not gain wealth quickly, raids became pointless. Fear could not sustain itself without reward. In some regions, resistance took a different form. People did not confront the Vikings directly. They harassed them. Small attacks, night ambushes, constant pressure. Never decisive, but never allowing rest. This wore down morale. A raid that promised silver turned into exhaustion, and exhaustion is dangerous for a force far from home. The Vikings also faced enemies who understood delay. Rather than meeting them in open battle, opponents waited. They let hunger work. They let weather turn. Time became a weapon. A raid planned for days stretched into weeks. Supplies ran low. Ships needed repair. Men grew restless. Fear was no longer one-sided. Some resistance was cultural. Communities refused to negotiate, refused to offer tribute, refused to recognize Viking authority. Without recognition, intimidation lost meaning. Power requires acknowledgement, and in these places, it was denied. The Vikings adapted, as they always did. They shifted targets. They avoided prolonged resistance. They returned to places where fear still worked. But this selective approach had consequences. Their reach narrowed.
Their dominance became uneven, not universal, but conditional. This interaction reshaped the Viking world. Raiding became more dangerous, rewards less certain. Some turned to settlement, others to trade. Violence remained, but it was no longer the only path. Fear still mattered, but it had limits. These encounters reveal an important truth. The Vikings did not simply impose terror, they tested it. And when it failed, they adjusted. Because fear is powerful, but only when it is believed. Once communities learned to endure it, the balance shifted. In the next segment, we will look at what happened when endurance turned into transformation, when Vikings stopped being outsiders and began to change the worlds they entered, not through fear alone, but through settlement, assimilation, and compromise. Because the end of terror did not mean the end of the Viking story. It meant its evolution.
At a certain point, raiding was no longer enough. Fear still opened doors, but it could not build homes. And for many Vikings, the world beyond Scandinavia offered something raids never could: stability. The shift did not happen all at once. It began quietly. A winter stayed longer than planned. A camp became permanent. Temporary shelters turned into walls. What started as opportunism slowly became settlement. Not because the Vikings grew peaceful, but because permanence offered new power. Land mattered. In Scandinavia, arable land was limited. Inheritance divided farms into fragments. Beyond the sea, there was space. Fields that could feed families, rivers that supported trade, coasts that connected worlds. To settle was to escape scarcity, and many Vikings chose that path. This decision changed everything. Settlers needed cooperation, not constant conflict. They married locally. They learned new languages. They adopted customs. Weapons were still present, but plows became just as important. The Viking identity began to blur, not erased, but transformed. Trade replaced terror in many regions. Vikings were skilled merchants. They understood value, networks, and negotiation. Silver flowed not just from raids, but from exchange. Markets grew, towns emerged. Violence did not disappear, but it became one tool among many, and often not the most profitable one. Religion played a role. Conversion was gradual, uneven, and pragmatic. Christianity offered access to alliances, legitimacy, and stability. Many Vikings adopted it not from conviction, but from calculation. Faith became political currency, and over time, belief followed convenience. Settlements became kingdoms. Loose leadership structures hardened. Kings gained authority. Laws were written instead of spoken. The Viking world centralized, slowly. What once thrived on fragmentation began to consolidate. This process weakened the old ways, but it strengthened states. Assimilation was not surrender, it was adaptation. Viking descendants ruled England, Normandy, and parts of Eastern Europe. Their influence did not vanish, it spread. Through bloodlines, through governance, through culture. Fear gave way to legacy. Yet something was lost. The mobility, the unpredictability, the freedom of movement. Settled societies require control. Borders replaced horizons. And with borders came responsibility. The Viking Age did not end in defeat. It ended in transformation. This transformation was irreversible. Once land was owned, it had to be defended. Once authority was claimed, it had to be maintained. The world that rewarded raiding gave way to one that punished it, and the Vikings changed with it. In the next segment, we will confront the moment when this transformation became unavoidable, when old gods faded, when new powers rose, and when the Viking Age, as it was known, began to close. Not with a final battle,
but with a quiet shift in identity.
The end of the Viking Age is often marked by dates, a battle, a conversion, a coronation. But history rarely ends so cleanly. What truly ended the Viking world was not a single event, but a slow collapse of conditions that once made it possible. Central power changed everything. As kingdoms solidified, authority became permanent. Kings no longer relied on reputation alone. They relied on taxation, law, and standing armies. This stability left little room for independent warbands. A man who once raided freely now owed loyalty to a crown, and loyalty demanded restraint. Christianity reshaped values, not overnight, but steadily. The old gods did not disappear, they faded. Public violence lost legitimacy. Raiding between Christian lands became politically costly. The church did not end warfare, but it reframed it. Violence now required justification, and justification limited opportunity. Trade networks expanded. Wealth no longer depended on plunder alone. Merchants replaced raiders. Ports replaced beaches. Economic integration made instability expensive. Raids disrupted markets. Markets punished raiders. Profit followed predictability, and predictability favored peace. Technology also played a role. Defensive architecture improved. Castles replaced wooden fortifications. Professional soldiers replaced local militias. Surprise became harder. Fear became less effective. The advantages the Vikings once relied on were slowly neutralized, not through conquest, but through adaptation. Scandinavia itself changed. Kings consolidated power. Borders formed. Internal conflicts were suppressed. Raiding abroad was no longer tolerated when stability at home became the priority. The Viking world turned inward, and outward expansion slowed. This did not erase Viking identity, it transformed it. Former raiders became rulers, explorers became administrators, warriors became nobles. The skills remained, but their use changed. Fear was replaced by authority. The Viking Age did not end because the Vikings were defeated. It ended because the world evolved, and the Vikings evolved with it. Those who did not adapt disappeared from history. Those who did helped shape medieval Europe. What remains is not a people frozen in violence, but a legacy embedded in nations, in laws, in language, in bloodlines. The Vikings did not vanish, they became something else. And that brings us to a final truth. History remembers extremes. It remembers terror and conquest. It rarely remembers adaptation. But adaptation, more than any battle, determines survival. In the final segment, we will step back and examine what the Viking story truly tells us. Not about raiding or fear, but about humanity itself. About how environments shape behavior, how myths replace nuance, and how people, when faced with harsh realities, change or disappear. Because the Viking story is not just theirs, it is ours. When the story of the Vikings is stripped of legend, what remains is not mystery, but recognition. They were not monsters born from chaos. They were not heroes carved from myth. They were people. The Viking world emerged from harsh conditions. Short growing seasons, limited land, constant competition. These pressures did not create morality or cruelty. They created necessity, and necessity shaped behavior. When survival depends on movement, on strength, on reputation, violence becomes a tool. Not a virtue, not an obsession, a response. Fear in this story is not accidental, it is engineered. The Vikings understood that fear could replace force, that terror could save lives, their own. They used it carefully, They monitored it. They withdrew when it failed. This was not mindless brutality. It was adaptation. But fear has limits. It works only as long as others believe in it. Once communities learned to endure, to organize, to resist, fear lost its power. And when fear faded, the Viking model weakened. The end of the Viking Age was not a collapse, it was a transition. Raiding gave way to settlement. Settlement gave way to states. Old identities dissolved into new ones. The same people, different structures. This pattern repeats throughout history. Groups rise under specific conditions. They thrive using strategies that work. They decline when the world changes, not because they fail, but because success becomes obsolete. The Viking story reminds us that power is temporary, that reputation fades, that survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. We remember the Vikings for their violence because violence leaves scars, but their true legacy lies elsewhere, in trade routes, in governance, in cultural exchange, in the quiet transformation from outsiders to insiders. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: if placed in the same world with the same pressures, others would have acted the same. The Vikings were not an anomaly. They were a mirror. History does not judge, it records. And what it records is that humanity responds to circumstance more than ideology. Fear shapes choices, environment shapes identity, and adaptation decides who remains. The Viking Age did not end in fire. It ended in silence. Not because the Vikings disappeared, but because they no longer needed to shout. They had become part of the world they once terrified. And that is how legends truly end.
The Viking Age may have ended, but its echoes did not. They carried forward, not in raids, but in memory. And memory, unlike history, does not preserve balance. What we know about the Vikings comes largely from those they frightened, from monks who watched monasteries burn, from chroniclers tasked with explaining chaos, from societies searching for meaning in sudden violence. Their accounts were not neutral. They were emotional, moral, desperate to understand why order collapsed. So they wrote the Vikings as punishment, as demons sent by God, as the embodiment of sin and disorder. These words endured. The Vikings themselves left little written history. Their stories were spoken, sung, carried in verse and memory. Oral tradition is powerful, but fragile. When cultures collide, the written word survives, the spoken word fades. And so the Viking voice was lost while others spoke for them. This imbalance shaped everything. Later generations inherited fear without context, violence without cause, raids without explanation. The Vikings became a symbol, not a society, and symbols are easy to simplify. In the centuries that followed, this image was repurposed, romanticized, exaggerated. In the 19th century, European nationalism reshaped the Viking past. They became heroes, founders, icons of strength and purity. The savage was reborn as a noble ancestor. Truth mattered less than usefulness. Modern media continued the cycle. Films emphasized brutality. Games glorified combat. Stories reduced complexity to spectacle. Each retelling moved further from historical reality, but repetition made it feel real. Myth became memory. This matters because how we remember shapes how we understand power. If the Vikings are remembered only as violent, we ignore the conditions that shaped them.
If they are remembered only as heroes, we excuse the damage they caused. Both extremes miss the truth. History lives in the middle, in pressures, in choices, in trade-offs. The Viking story is not about savagery or glory. It is about response. Response to scarcity, to opportunity, to a changing world. When we examine how the Viking image was constructed, we learn something uncomfortable. We learn how easily narratives are shaped by fear, by trauma, and by distance, and how quickly complexity is lost when stories are retold without context. This is not unique to the Vikings. Every society does this. We flatten the past to make it manageable. We turn people into symbols because symbols are easier to remember than realities. In the next segment, we will step away from the Vikings themselves and look at what their story teaches us about storytelling, power, and myth. Because the way we remember the Vikings reveals just as much about us as it does about them.
Stories do not survive because they are accurate. They survive because they are useful. The Viking story endured not because it was told completely, but because it served a purpose. For medieval Europe, it explained fear. For religious writers, it justified suffering. For kings, it defined enemies. And later, for nations, it created identity. Myths are tools. They simplify complex events into narratives that can be repeated. They assign roles, heroes, villains, victims. And once those roles are fixed, questioning them becomes uncomfortable. The Vikings were assigned the role of chaos. Once that role was accepted, every action was interpreted through it. This is how myth replaces nuance. Trade becomes theft. Migration becomes invasion. Survival becomes savagery. Context disappears. And without context, judgment becomes easy. Power depends on storytelling. Those who control narrative shape perception. In the Viking Age, the church held the pen. Later, states and artists took over. At no point were the Vikings allowed to speak for themselves. Their story was inherited, not recorded. This dynamic repeats endlessly. Empires justify conquest by labeling resistance as barbarism. Nations define themselves by exaggerating the violence of others. The past becomes a mirror used to validate the present, and truth becomes optional. The Viking story teaches us to question extremes. When a group is remembered only for violence, we should ask what was omitted. When a group is remembered only for strength, we should ask who paid the price. Myth protects power by removing responsibility. Understanding this does not excuse harm. The Vikings caused suffering, that is undeniable. But understanding cause is not the same as justification. History demands distinction. When myth dominates, learning stops. Because myth offers certainty. History offers discomfort. The Viking story, when examined honestly, forces us to confront complexity. And complexity resists slogans. This is why myths persist. They are easier than asking difficult questions. They allow distance instead of empathy. They turn history into entertainment. But when we look past myth, we gain something valuable: perspective. We see how people adapt, how power shifts, how survival strategies evolve. And we recognize patterns that still exist today. In the next segment, we will examine those patterns, not in the past, but in the present.
Because the forces that shaped the Vikings did not disappear. They changed form. And understanding them may be more relevant now than ever before.
The forces that shaped the Vikings did not vanish with time. They transformed, and they continue to shape the world in familiar ways. Scarcity still drives movement. When land becomes limited, when resources tighten, people migrate. They search for opportunity, for stability, for survival. The Vikings did not invent this pattern. They followed it, and history has repeated it again and again. Fear still precedes conflict. Before violence begins, there is always a narrative, a story that explains why action is necessary, why aggression is justified, why others are dangerous. The Vikings were labeled threats before they were understood. Today, different groups carry that label. The mechanism remains the same. Power still relies on perception. Reputation matters. A force believed to be unstoppable often becomes unstoppable, not because it is stronger, but because resistance collapses early. The Vikings understood this intuitively. Modern powers understand it strategically. Fear reduces cost. Environment still shapes behavior. Harsh conditions demand adaptation. Stable conditions reward cooperation. When circumstances shift, so do values. The Viking transition from raiding to settlement mirrors countless transformations throughout history. What works in one era fails in another. Myth still replaces complexity. Stories simplify. They divide the world into familiar roles: hero, enemy, victim. This makes conflict digestible, but it also hides responsibility. The Viking myth did not disappear. It evolved, just like the people it describes. We often believe we are more advanced than the past, more informed, more rational, but the patterns persist. Fear still motivates policy. Narratives still justify action. Power still shapes memory. The tools have changed. The structure has not. The Viking story reminds us that behavior is contextual. Remove context, and judgment becomes distorted. Add context, and understanding grows uncomfortable, but necessary. This is not an argument for relativism. It is an argument for awareness. Understanding why people act does not absolve consequences. It clarifies them. When we reduce the Vikings to symbols of violence, we lose the lesson. The lesson is not about raids. It is about systems, about how pressure produces behavior, about how myths preserve power. The past does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes, and the rhyme is clear. Where fear dominates, conflict follows. Where adaptation occurs, survival improves. In the next segment, we will return to the Viking world one last time to examine what was left behind, not in battles or borders, but in culture, language, and identity. Because the most enduring legacy of the Vikings was not destruction, it was influence. The Viking Age left no single monument, no final capital, no unified empire. What it left instead was influence, quiet, embedded, enduring. Language carries some of the clearest traces. Everyday words, simple, practical, unremarkable, trace back to the Viking world. Words for tools, for trade, for navigation. They did not arrive through conquest alone. They arrived through contact. Living together, working together, raising families together. Language changes only when people do. Place names tell a similar story. Across England, Ireland, and beyond, settlements still carry echoes of Norse presence. Villages, towns, geographical markers. These names survived long after raids ended. They remained because people remained, not as invaders, but as neighbors. Law was another legacy. Viking assemblies emphasized participation, dispute resolution, public judgment. These ideas blended with local systems, not adopted wholesale, but adapted. The result was not Viking law, but something shaped by it. Influence rarely arrives intact. It arrives altered. Trade networks expanded Viking reach far beyond their battles. Silver from the Islamic world, goods from Eastern Europe, ideas from distant cultures. The Vikings were connectors. They moved information as much as wealth, and in doing so, they helped shape a more connected world. Cultural identity also shifted. In places where Vikings settled, new identities emerged, not Norse, not local, but something in between. Hybrid cultures formed through compromise, necessity, and time. These identities outlived the Viking Age itself. Even memory was influenced. The sagas preserved stories not as history, but as meaning. They emphasized honor, choice, consequence. These were not records of events. They were reflections of how people understood themselves, and that self-understanding mattered. The Viking legacy is uncomfortable because it resists simplicity. It is neither wholly destructive nor purely creative. It is human, marked by harm and contribution, by loss and connection. When we search for Viking influence, we rarely find it where violence occurred. We find it where people stayed, where lives intertwined, where futures were built. That is where legacy forms. This challenges how we measure impact, not by how loudly a group arrives, but by how deeply it integrates. The Vikings did not change Europe by ending it. They changed it by becoming part of it. In the next segment, we will examine a final tension: why the violent image of the Vikings survived longer than their cultural influence, and what that says about how history chooses what to remember and what to forget.
Violence is easy to remember. It is loud. It is sudden. It leaves scars. Influence is quiet. It unfolds slowly, often unnoticed, woven into daily life. And history, more often than not, remembers the noise. The Viking image endured, not because it was accurate, but because it was dramatic. Burning monasteries are easier to visualize than shared harvests. Raids create stories with clear beginnings and ends. Cultural exchange does not. So violence became the headline. Memory favors shock. Moments of crisis imprint deeply. Moments of cooperation blur. This is not intentional distortion. It is human nature. Trauma sharpens recollection. Stability fades into background. The Viking raids traumatized communities. The settlements did not. Narratives also prefer conflict. Conflict creates heroes and villains. Settlement creates compromise. And compromise is difficult to dramatize. It resists simple morality. So, stories reduce complexity. The Viking becomes the invader. Everything else disappears. Time reinforces this imbalance. Early records focused on suffering. Later retellings amplified it. Each generation inherited the same core image and added exaggeration. Correction requires effort. Repetition does not. Modern media magnified the distortion. Violence sells. It provides spectacle, tension, identity. The Viking warrior became an icon, detached from context. Cultural depth was replaced by aesthetic aggression. Axes, shields, rage. The image survived because it was marketable. This selective memory shapes identity. For descendants, the Viking becomes a symbol of strength. For others, a symbol of terror.
Both interpretations rely on simplification, and simplification hides responsibility. The cost of this distortion is understanding. When violence dominates memory, we lose insight into how societies change. We mistake destruction for dominance. We confuse fear with power. The Viking story becomes shallow. Yet the quieter legacy remains in institutions, in language, in shared ancestry. But these traces require curiosity. They demand patience, and history does not always reward patience. Understanding why violence is remembered more than influence helps us read the past more honestly. It reminds us that what survives in memory is not always what mattered most. In the next segment, we will confront a final reflection: what the Viking story ultimately reveals about how societies define themselves through the stories they choose to keep. Because memory is not neutral, it is curated, and that curation shapes the future.
Societies define themselves by contrast, by identifying who they are not, and the Viking story has long served that purpose. For medieval Europe, the Vikings represented chaos beyond the edge of the known world. They were used to define order by opposition: Christian versus pagan, settled versus wandering, law versus violence. The Viking was the boundary marker. Everything beyond it was framed as dangerous. This pattern is ancient. Civilizations often describe outsiders in extreme terms. It simplifies identity. If the enemy is barbaric, then the self is civilized. If the outsider is violent, then internal authority feels justified. The Viking myth fit neatly into this structure. Later societies inherited the same contrast. National identities were built by selecting convenient ancestors and convenient enemies. The Viking could be reclaimed as strength or rejected as savagery. The facts mattered less than the function. What is often overlooked is that these narratives say little about the Vikings themselves. They reveal more about those telling the story. Fear needs an object. Order needs a threat. The Vikings filled both roles. This does not mean the violence was imagined. It was real, and it caused suffering. But violence alone does not explain persistence in memory. Many violent groups fade from history. The Vikings endured because their image was useful. Understanding this forces an uncomfortable reflection. How many groups today are remembered primarily for the moments they disrupted order? How many are defined by the fear they caused rather than the lives they lived? The Viking story is not unique. It is instructive. Identity built on opposition is always fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. New threats must replace old ones. New myths must be written. The Viking faded as Europe stabilized, but the structure remained. Only the names changed. History becomes dangerous when stories harden into identity, when myths replace inquiry, when complexity is sacrificed for coherence. The Viking narrative warns us about this process. If we look carefully, we see that societies grow not by defeating others, but by absorbing difference. The Vikings did not destroy Europe. They were absorbed by it, and Europe changed as a result. This perspective reframes conflict. It suggests that survival is not about domination, it is about integration, not about erasing difference, but negotiating it. In the next segment, we will step back one final time, not to examine the Vikings, but to examine ourselves, to ask what stories we inherit, why we repeat them, and what responsibility we carry when we tell history. Because the past is not fixed, it is retold, and every retelling is a choice. Every generation inherits stories before it inherits facts. These stories arrive early. They shape imagination long before understanding develops. By the time facts appear, the narrative is already familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. The Viking story is one of those inheritances. We learn it through images, ships on firelit shores, warriors shouting into battle, a world divided into conquerors and victims. These images settle quietly. They become reference points, rarely questioned. But inherited stories carry responsibility. To repeat them unexamined is to preserve distortion. Not because the past demands accuracy, but because the present demands honesty. When we tell history, we choose what matters, what to emphasize, what to omit, and those choices shape understanding. The Viking narrative teaches us how easily complexity is lost, how pressure becomes cruelty, how adaptation becomes aggression, how survival becomes savagery. These transformations happen not in events, but in retellings. We often ask whether history is written by the victors. A better question is this: who repeats it? Because repetition solidifies memory, and memory resists correction. The Viking image survived not because it was defended, but because it was convenient. This should make us cautious, not just about the Vikings, but about all historical narratives, especially those that feel settled, especially those that require no explanation. Certainty is rarely a sign of accuracy. It is often a sign of comfort. Understanding history requires discomfort. It asks us to hold contradictions, to accept that people can be both harmful and adaptive, that cultures can destroy and create, that identity is shaped by pressure, not destiny. When we engage the Viking story honestly, we confront these contradictions. We see how fear operates, how myths function, how environments influence behavior, and we recognize patterns that extend far beyond the past. This recognition does not diminish history, it deepens it. It moves us from judgment to understanding, from spectacle to insight. The responsibility of storytelling is not to simplify, it is to clarify, not to protect identity, but to reveal process. The Viking story, told carefully, becomes less about them and more about us. In the next segment, we will consider one final question. What happens when stories stop evolving? When myths harden into unquestioned truth? And what is lost when we stop asking how the past actually worked? Because the danger of history is not forgetting, it is believing we already know.
When stories stop evolving, they stop teaching. They become fixed objects, repeated, protected, and rarely examined. And when that happens, history turns from inquiry into belief. A myth that is no longer questioned does not inform, it instructs. It tells us what to think instead of asking us to understand. The Viking story, once frozen in popular imagination, became exactly that, a conclusion, not a question. This is where history loses its value, because the past is not a set of answers, it is a record of processes, of cause and effect, of pressure and response. When myths harden, those processes disappear. Only symbols remain. Frozen narratives are comfortable. They remove ambiguity. They remove responsibility. If the Vikings were simply violent, then nothing needs explaining. No environment, no scarcity, no incentive, just savagery. But comfort comes at a cost. The cost is repetition. When we stop examining how violence emerges, we stop recognizing it when it forms again. When we reduce complexity to caricature, we lose the ability to respond intelligently to similar pressures in the present. History stops being preparation. It becomes decoration. This is why questioning the Viking myth matters, not to defend the Vikings, not to condemn them further, but to restore movement to the story.
to show how behavior changes when conditions change, how fear grows, how fear fades, how societies adapt or collapse. A static story cannot explain change. A dynamic one can. The Viking Age was dynamic. It rose because conditions allowed it. It ended because conditions shifted. That pattern is more important than any single raid or battle. When myths dominate, we inherit certainty without understanding. And certainty is dangerous. It closes inquiry. It resists evidence. It protects identity over truth. This applies far beyond the Viking story. Every society carries frozen narratives, stories that explain who belongs, who threatens, and who must be controlled. These stories feel ancient. They feel justified, but they are choices. History becomes most valuable when it is allowed to breathe, when stories are revisited, reframed, questioned, not to erase the past, but to understand it more fully. The Viking story, once unfrozen, reveals not chaos, but structure, not madness, but response, not destiny, but adaptation. In the next and final segment, we will bring everything together, not to summarize events, but to reflect on meaning. What the Viking Age ultimately tells us about fear, power, and survival, and why those lessons still matter, not as history, but as warning. Fear is one of the oldest forces shaping human behavior. It predates nations, it predates religion, it predates history itself. The Viking Age is not unique because of its violence. It is revealing because of how fear was used, managed, and eventually outgrown. The Vikings learned that fear could open doors. It could empty villages. It could break resistance before battle began. But they also learned something else. Fear is temporary. It fades when people adapt. It weakens when patterns are understood. It collapses when communities organize. Fear is powerful, but unstable. Power that relies on fear must constantly prove itself. It must escalate. It must shock again and again. The moment fear becomes predictable, it loses value. This is why the Viking model could not last forever. Not because it failed, but because it depended on conditions that changed. The transition away from fear was not moral, it was practical. Settlement offered stability. Trade offered reliability. Authority offered continuity. Fear could not provide those things, and so it was replaced. This pattern repeats throughout history. Groups rise using disruption. They dominate through intimidation. They decline when stability becomes more valuable than chaos. The names change, the methods evolve, the structure remains. The Viking story shows us that survival is not about strength alone. It is about timing, knowing when to push, knowing when to stop, knowing when a strategy has reached its limit. Those who recognize this survive. Those who do not are remembered only as cautionary tales. Fear also shapes memory. We remember what frightened us more vividly than what sustained us. This is why Viking violence overshadowed Viking influence. Fear imprints, stability fades. But imprint is not importance. Understanding this allows us to separate impact from attention. The Vikings were feared, but they were influential in quieter ways. Their legacy lives not in terror, but in integration, in the systems that absorbed them. The lesson is not that fear is evil. It is that fear is inefficient over time. It exhausts those who wield it and those who endure it. Long-term survival favors adaptation over intimidation.
When we look at the Viking Age honestly, we see a complete cycle. Emergence, dominance, transformation. Not collapse, not defeat. Evolution. In the final segment, we will close this story, not with a verdict, but with perspective. What the Vikings ultimately teach us about humanity's relationship with fear, power, and change, and why those lessons are worth remembering long after the ships have disappeared from the horizon.
The Viking Age did not end in fire. It ended in understanding. Not an understanding written in law or carved in stone, but one learned slowly through failure, adaptation, and change. The Vikings began as survivors in a world that offered little mercy. They used what worked: speed, fear, reputation. Not because they were evil, but because the world rewarded it. And when the world changed, they changed too. This is the lesson history rarely emphasizes, that people are not defined by one moment, one action, or one reputation. They are defined by response. Response to pressure, to opportunity, to limitation. The Vikings responded as humans always do. They adapted. Fear shaped their rise, but fear did not shape their future. Stability did. Connection did. Integration did. When terror stopped working, they did not disappear. They transformed. And transformation, not conquest, is what allowed their legacy to survive. What remains today is not the sound of battle. It is language, law, culture. Traces embedded so deeply we rarely notice them. That is the mark of lasting influence. The Viking story is not a story about savagery or glory. It is a story about systems, about how environments create behavior, how fear accelerates change, how adaptation determines survival. These forces did not vanish with the past. They shape the present. Every age has its Vikings, not in name, but in pattern. Groups responding to scarcity, using fear as leverage, adapting or failing when conditions shift. Understanding this pattern does not excuse harm. It prepares us to recognize it. History does not repeat exactly, but it leaves instructions, not commands, but warnings. Ignore context, and violence seems irrational. Ignore adaptation, and collapse seems inevitable. The Viking Age teaches us to look deeper. If this story changed how you see the Vikings, or how you see history itself, then it did its job. Because understanding the past is not about knowing dates, it is about recognizing patterns. This is what we do here. We don't chase legends, we dismantle them. We don't simplify history, we sit with its complexity. If you want more stories like this, stories that go beyond myth, beyond spectacle, beyond surface, then stay with us. Subscribe to Let Me Tell You, because history has more to say when we're willing to listen. And there are still many stories that haven't been told, not because they were hidden, but because no one slowed down enough to hear them.